The governor yesterday announced that he wants to temporarily keep Syrian refugees from coming to Illinois. He joins a whole host of other governors from across the country that are doing the same. You've also got Senator Rand Paul throwing up a measure that will put a moratorium on accepting visas from countries where there's jihadist movements. To get kind of a reaction to what's happening here in Illinois, and maybe some of the sentiment that's out there after the attacks in Paris and the just what seems to be regular onslaught of internet videos of radical groups doing horrible things. And I hope that this will actually be the beginning of ongoing conversations with the Council on American-Islamic Relations. Renner Larson, he is the communications coordinator for the Council on American-Islamic Relations, Chicago, and he joins me now. Renner, thank you for taking time. How are you this morning?
Thank you for having me, Greg.
Absolutely. So let's get right into this. Your initial reaction to Governor Rauner's announcement yesterday?
I was outraged. I mean, you know, my relatives from a couple generations ago were immigrants. They came to this country, and here we have a gift from the French, the Statue of Liberty, standing on Ellis Island, and at its feet is written, "Give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses." To then slam the door in their face seems completely un-American and unnecessary.
One of the responses to your statements elsewhere in the media that it's a knee-jerk reaction is, how can it not be a knee-jerk reaction, especially when we see, at least in one instance in France, somebody from Syria being involved in those attacks? How can it not be a knee-jerk reaction?
I mean, if you look at since 9/11, there have been over 750,000 refugees relocated to the United States. Of them, you know how many have been arrested for domestic terrorism? Zero. And that's not me just saying that. That's The Economist. And so there's this idea that, you know, because refugees are coming from a place of war, that they somehow will bring the war with them. But they're running from the same enemy that we're trying to protect ourselves against.
We're talking with Renner Larson, communications coordinator for the Council on American-Islamic Relations, to get his response to the governor's call for a temporary halt of accepting Syrian refugees. And it's not just Illinois' governor, Renner. We've got governors across the country who are doing this. And I don't know if you heard earlier in your introduction, Senator Rand Paul pushing for a moratorium on visas from countries where there are Islamic extremists or jihadist movements. What's your response to the overall tenor that seems to be developing across the country to Islamic radicals?
I mean, you've seen a huge recent wave in Islamophobic rhetoric on both sides of the aisle, not just Republicans. And, you know, I think that it's a dangerous precedent. I understand why people are afraid of ISIS. They're a terrifying force in this world. But what people fail to understand is that refugees, as well as American Muslims that are already here, are not conspirators in all this. They're our first line of defense. If you look at cases in which people trying to join ISIS have been caught or terrorism plots have been foiled, it wasn't just the FBI sitting and walking around going door to door. It is because the American Muslim community has stepped up. They've reported these people. A vast majority of these cases have been blown open because the American Muslim community has stepped up. And for us to further alienate them is exactly what the extremists are hoping will happen when they do attacks like this. Because the American Muslim community is the people that are their biggest threat in terms of getting away with things.
And when I talked with you yesterday for the Illinois News Network, you had said something to the effect of having Syrian refugees in Illinois would actually help defend against radical extremists. Can you unpack that a bit and maybe elaborate on that sentiment?
So refugees, especially those from Syria, are highly educated. They're these aren't kind of the street stuff. They're doctors and lawyers and engineers. Here are people coming to our country with the hopes of a better life and contributing to our society. And they also appreciate our values. They're coming here because we're a country that has freedom. They're coming from a horribly oppressive regime, and nobody recognizes and appreciates our freedoms more than that. And if you look at our history, refugees have been on the front lines of advancing our country. You look at Albert Einstein, Oppenheimer, Madeleine Albright. They all came to our country as refugees. If you imagine during World War II, if we had said, we won't take any refugees because they might be German spies, where would that put us today? And there is plenty of evidence to show that there were refugees from Germany that did end up being German spies, but we caught them and we won the war because we're America, and that's what we do.
Oh, and I don't even want to get into Operation Paperclip, if you're familiar with that at all, where we actually took German scientists and split them up between Russia and the United States. That's a bit of history that we'll have to get into another day. We're talking with Renner Larson. He is the communication coordinator for the Council on American-Islamic Relations, to get his reaction to the governor's call and other governors across the country calling for a temporary freeze in accepting Syrian refugees. What is the council doing to help battle radical Islam?
We do a lot. So we partner with the FBI often, and it comes from a lot of trying to build that trust between law enforcement and the Muslim community, and so we kind of find ourselves in this middle point as the bridge oftentimes. So we do a lot of community development. We do a lot of youth outreach, which helps strengthen our youth and help them understand what Islam really teaches, and help them understand how to responsibly use social media and how to help parents talk to their children about responsible social media use, as well as kind of this extremist rhetoric on both the anti-Islam and radical extremes. And then we also work with the FBI to kind of help the Muslim community know their rights and kind of feel more comfortable when they are contacted by the FBI or something else like that, because the last thing you want is to have the population fear law enforcement. That's one of the biggest problems you find, is that you have, in heavily policed populations, you often find them distrustful, and so we do what we can to educate them about the American justice system, about what their rights are and what their kind of legal status is, and how they can interact with the law enforcement in an educated and informed manner.
7:49 now in the capital city. We've got about 54 degrees. It's raining. News Talk 970 WMAY. We're talking with Renner Larson. He's the communications coordinator for the Council on American-Islamic Relations, Chicago. And another issue that we hear a lot about is the double standard in some Islamic countries, where here we are talking about Illinois not really being willing to accept Syrian refugees, but we've got the double standard, like, for instance, the Gulf states not willing to accept refugees, or maybe in some diehard Islamic extremist types of areas where they're not accepting of anybody else who's not Islamic, who's not a Muslim, like, for instance, homosexuals or Christians. Can you address that double standard? Is that something inherent in Islam, or is that something that's just part of Islamic extremists?
It's definitely not something that's inherent in Islam. And if you look at other religions, you see the same thing. So Joseph Kony, who went viral in 2012, the Lord's Resistance Army did a very similar thing to what ISIS is doing. They took over huge swaths of land in Central Africa, and they wanted to replace law and order with the Ten Commandments. Not like traffic laws or anything else, just the Ten Commandments. That's the only form of law. And they violently killed thousands of people in doing so, oppressed minorities, oppressed these things, this isn't a exclusively Muslim issue. It's a issue that has to do with a history of war in the region and socioeconomic strife. And as in terms of the Gulf states stepping up, if you look at countries like Jordan and Turkey, there are 4 million refugees in camps in those countries. And they have done their part in stepping up, as has Lebanon. And, there are countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE that have not been as active, but that's not really part of the question. We're asking, what should we do? And if you're walking down the street and you see someone being mugged and their brother is standing next to them doing nothing, do you really go, oh, I'm not going to help that person because their brother isn't helping them? No, you go over and help them because it's the right thing to do.
So again, to wrap up our conversation with Renner Larson, Communications Coordinator for the Council on American-Islamic Relations, Chicago, your reaction to the governor and his call to put a temporary hold on accepting Syrian refugees?
Is outrage. I think that it is not only wrong on a humanitarian level, but it's wrong on a national security level. Syrian refugees are here to work and be productive members of society, and because we have these essential American values that they don't have where they're coming from. That's what they're fleeing from, and to come here, they will be valuable members of our society, and they are the first line of defense against extremists.
Renner Larson, expand on that last statement a bit if you can.
So American Muslims are the vast majority when it comes to fighting violent extremism. They talk about it every day. It's a big part of their lives. It's in the news. They're constantly questioned about it. They can't go anywhere without being reminded about it. And
kind of like you coming on the air with me this morning to talk about it.
Exactly. Anytime anything happens, there's demands for apologies and condemnation, which are always there. And if you look at similar incidents, I'm a mid-20-somethings white male, non-Muslim, and every time someone walks into a school and shoots it up, nobody asks me for an apology or a condemnation. And so there's a double standard there. But American Muslims have really stepped up in terms of the vast majority of cases that have been reported to the FBI have been reported by friends and relatives and other people within the Muslim community who have said, look, this is not representative of me. This is not something that you should be doing in the name of my belief. And they've reported it to the FBI because they believe in American ideals and they want us to have a safe and free country. That's why they came here.
Renner, that's all the time we've got, but let's make this happen again in the near future, all right?
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Renner Larson, Communications Coordinator for the Council on American-Islamic Relations, Chicago, with News Talk 970 WMAY.